Chapter 16. Just a Joke. "Hi, Davy," said Alex. "Would you like one of my crisp sandwiches?" Davy looked up from his break box, surprised. He wasn't the only one. I looked at Alex, surprised and suspicious, suspicious and surprised. Alex wasn't usually nice to Davy. What was he up to? "What flavour crisps?" Davy asked, through a smile big enough to turn upside down and shelter under out of the rain. Alex was talking to him. Alex was offering to share a sandwich with him. Davy was so happy. My insides were about to melt. "Cheese and onion," said Alex. "My mum makes them special. You'll love them." "Yes, please," said Davy. Davy reached out for the sandwich Alex held out to him. "Oh, no," said Alex. "I'll hold it. Your hands might not be clean. You can eat half and I'll have the other half. That's fair, isn't it?" I stood up, my heart dive bouncing like a bungee jumper. "Yes, that's fair," said Davy, and he took a bite, one bite, and he chewed with a smile and swallowed with a frown, and the whole class watched. The very air held its breath as Davy started to cough, and Alex cracked up laughing, and Davy coughed harder, and Alex laughed more. But then the laughing stopped, as Davy's hands flew to his throat, tearing at his skin, clawing at the invisible hands, choking him from the inside out. His face erupted in red blotches, the whites of his eyes were turning red. He couldn't breathe. He fell to his knees, his eyes on me, and Alicia screamed. Lucy ran to get help. Claudia started to shriek. Martin shouted at Alex. "It was only one peanut," cried Alex. "I only put one peanut in there. It was just a joke. I thought he'd sneeze. It was just a joke." Davy fell on his side, his eyes on me, and was still. I ran over to Davy to loosen his shirt collar, but it was already undone, and Davy was so still. Mr. Mackey ran into the room holding a fat grey pen. He pushed us out of the way and took the top off the pen before jamming the other end into Davy's thigh. "Come on, Davy, please," begged Mr. Mackey, but Davy was so still. Mr. Mackey kept the pen against Davy's thigh for long, long seconds. "It was only a joke, sir," said Alex. "I only meant it as a joke," and he started to cry, great big rolling tears as he watched Davy. "Lucy, run to the office and tell them to phone for an ambulance," said Mr. Mackey, "and for God's sake, hurry." I turned to Alex and saw myself and hated what I saw. I hated Alex so much, but I hated myself more. And Davy's eyes were on me, still watching me, still. 17. Fine. Davy was okay. The pen Mr. Mackey jabbed into his leg was a special pen full of adrenaline. It did the trick. By the time the ambulance arrived, Davy was no longer unconscious. He said he was okay. "I'm fine, Mr. Mackey, I'm fine." But his face was still red and his lips were swollen and he couldn't stand up and he kept scratching his skin. Mr. Mackey insisted that he went to the hospital. Davy's mum was going to meet him there. As the school secretary helped Davy out of the classroom, Mr. Mackey closed the door and turned to me and said, "Sam, tell me exactly what's been going on. Now." So I did, every detail. Mr. Mackey picked up Alex's sandwich from the floor where it had fallen and opened it. One more peanut sat in amongst the crisps on the other side of the sandwich. Mr. Mackey was so angry. Alex was still crying. Mr. Mackey took Alex out to see the head. While he was gone, I turned around and everyone was looking at me, eyes on me again. "It wasn't my fault," I whispered helplessly, hopelessly. If I knew what Alex was up to, I'd have stopped him. A few eyes turned away at that in disgust, in disbelief. Why didn't anyone believe me? Davy was my friend. I wouldn't have let Alex do it. But no one knew Davy was my friend because I didn't want anyone to know. They thought I was with Alex, like Alex, another Alex. No, they thought I was Sam, worse than Alex, and they were all right. I was worse because I was a coward. Davy could be my friend, as long as no one found out, as long as no one knew, just him and me, just me and him. Davy, just you and me and you, a secret shared to be shared by two. I ran from the room, I escaped to the toilets, I locked the door and lowered the lid, and sat down and looked at my shoes and watched the water fall from my eyes, escape from my eyes, flee, break free and drop from my eyes, splash onto my trainers, splish splash, spatter splatter. Chapter 18. How could you? Davy's mum refused to let her son come back to a school where anyone could do that to her boy. Davy's mum said she'd have to be dead before her son came back to a school where anyone could do that to her boy. Davy's mum was more than ready, willing and able to move house, if she had to move cities, if she had to move abroad, if she had to, before her son came back to a school where anybody could do that to her boy. Chapter 19. Davy's gone. I went to visit Davy in hospital. I took him some grapes and a couple of Spider-Man comics and my favourite science fiction book that I didn't lend to anyone except good friends, best friends. I went with my mum to the hospital. Mum chatted to Davy's mum whilst Davy sat up in bed eating the grapes and eyeing the comics and flicking through the pages of my science fiction book that I didn't lend to anyone except good friends, best friends. Davy's mum had calmed down by now. Besides, Davy wanted to stay at school. He didn't want to move to another one. Why not? Asked his mum. Because, was all Davy would say. Because isn't a reason, said his mum. Davy shrugged. He'd said everything he wanted to say. No more, no less. He looked at me, and there were no sparkles or smiles or sideways thoughts in his eyes. He looked at me, the way everyone else looked at me. No more, no less. What do you think of these curtains, Davy? I asked desperately. Where had the old Davy gone? They're okay, shrugged Davy. Okay? They were more than okay. The hospital curtains around his bed were swirls of living colour, shouting scarlets, yelling yellows, booming blues and gargling greens. Up and down and round, dancing, melting, merging around each other, hipping, hopping, tapping, bopping, alive. They're okay, Davy said again. Where had the old Davy gone?